when a quiet 11-year-old girl named Mia stepped out of a rusted sedan onto the gravel driveway of the Owens farmhouse. The first words she spoke made the social worker flinch. What had been described as a routine foster placement suddenly seemed far more foreboding. What followed was an unsettling pattern of half-glimpsed secrets and unnerving silence, unraveling a truth darker than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe that every hidden truth should eventually come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Mia Harper had never wanted to come here. She had lived in multiple homes since the age of 6, each move accompanied by false promises that the next place would be the one that felt like home. Now, as she clutched a plastic bag of secondhand clothes and a slim notebook containing half her life story, she felt a pang of deep, unshakable apprehension. The social worker, Miss Danforth, walked her to the weather-beaten front porch, offered her a strained smile, and knocked on the door. Mia's grip on her notebook tightened. She had learned through experience that words unrecorded often vanished or morphed into someone else's version of the truth. Nancy Owens answered the door. She possessed a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and as she greeted Mia in a sing-song voice, Mia detected a practiced quality to it. Still, Mia was used to forced warmth. Many foster parents performed kindness in front of the officials. Nancy's husband, Gerald Owens, appeared behind her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a heavily lined face that might have looked friendly in another life. Now it only seemed guarded. He said little. Mia murmured a greeting, keeping her eyes down. Nancy and Gerald led her inside with choreographed politeness, the sort that made Mia's spine prickle. The farmhouse felt oddly timeless, suspended somewhere between musty age and a forced attempt at modernity. The floors were old hardwood, some planks creaking underfoot. The walls had yellowing wallpaper that curled at the corners. Family photos were sparse, oddly so for a house as large as this. Mia saw only one framed picture on a shelf, Nancy and Gerald dressed in stilted smiles, standing in front of a lake. No children were in the photograph. The social worker quickly discussed Mia's file, scribbled some last-minute notes, shook Nancy's hand, and gave Gerald a curt nod before departing in a hurry. Mia stood at the threshold of the living room, feeling that ephemeral wave of panic whenever a social worker left her behind in a strange house. Nancy showed Mia to a small bedroom on the second floor. It was a cramped space with pale walls and a single window facing the backyard. From that window, Mia saw the overgrown garden, a lonely oak tree, and a shed near the fence line. Its door was secured with a heavy padlock. Even from the distance, the vines crawling up its side gave the impression of a place deliberately left to rot. She forced her attention back to the bedroom, noticing the single bed, a rickety nightstand, and a bare bulb that flickered overhead. "I'll let you unpack," Nancy said with a practiced, high-pitched sweetness. "Dinner's at 6. We run a tight schedule here, Mia. You'll see soon enough." Mia nodded, waiting for Nancy's footsteps to retreat. Once the door clicked shut, Mia breathed more freely. She set her plastic bag on the bed and gently placed her notebook down. She sat beside her meager belongings, heart hammering, uncertain how this house would test her. She had learned to survive by becoming invisible. Yet the moment she'd stepped through the door, the sense of being watched had felt more tangible here than anywhere else. At dinner, Mia sat across from Gerald. The table was set with meticulous care, placemats, cloth napkins, even a small vase of wildflowers. Nancy ladled soup into bowls, and Gerald tore slices of homemade bread. Their movements were silent, methodical. No television or radio played in the background. No conversation broke the hush except for Nancy's occasional attempts to ask Mia about her schooling. Mia answered in small, clipped sentences. She rarely offered information unprompted. She had learned that secrets were safer when locked inside. "Your social worker says you're good at writing," Nancy said. "That you keep a journal. That's a lovely hobby." Mia felt a chill at the mention of her notebook. "I like to write things down," she replied softly. Gerald didn't speak, but he watched her with a sidelong glance. His face betrayed nothing, but his posture, unmoving, shoulders tense, made Mia feel as if he was studying her. She set her spoon down, a slight tremble in her hands. Nancy noticed. "Don't be nervous," Nancy insisted, that forced smile returning. "We just want what's best for you, Mia." After dinner, they gave her a brief tour of the house. The small living room, the cluttered study that belonged to Gerald, and a narrow hallway leading to a locked door. The basement, they said, used only for storage. Mia caught sight of a row of hooks by the back door where a ring of keys hung. Gerald noticed her gaze and immediately closed the basement door, turning the lock with a click. "There's nothing interesting down there," Nancy explained, not quite meeting Mia's eyes. Mia nodded again, swallowing a nagging sense of unease. She excused herself to her room soon after. The old clock in the hall chimed 8, which felt early, but the Owens insisted on lights out at 9. With so little time before bed, Mia perched on the edge of the narrow mattress, opened her notebook, and wrote down what she had observed: Nancy's static grin, Gerald's watchful silence, the locked shed in the backyard, the locked basement, and the hush that pervaded every hallway. She slept fitfully, jolted awake twice by the sound of footsteps in the corridor. On the second occasion, she was almost certain she saw a shadow slip beneath the crack of her door. But she convinced herself it was only her overactive imagination. She pulled the covers up to her chin and counted her breaths, eventually drifting back to uneasy slumber. By dawn, sunlight peeked through the threadbare curtain. Mia got dressed, grabbed her notebook, and crept downstairs. Nancy was already awake, preparing breakfast with a practiced calm. Mia offered to help but received a tight-lipped refusal. Moments later, Gerald thumped down the stairs. He paused in the entryway, yawned, and eyed Mia as though trying to decide if she was worth acknowledging. Finally, he dipped his head in something like a greeting and proceeded to the kitchen. "We have chores," Nancy announced once breakfast plates were cleared. She listed out Mia's responsibilities: cleaning her own room, tidying the living room, carefully watering the plants around the property. Nothing seemed too difficult at first, but Nancy's voice grew stony as she explained there would be no locked doors inside the house. Except, of course, the basement. Mia felt a sting of curiosity at that. If everyone's bedroom had to remain unlocked, then the only privacy she'd have would be in her own head. Yet she kept her expression neutral. She began her chores methodically, not wanting to give the Owens any reason to complain. She dusted the living room shelves, eyes drifting to the single photograph of Nancy and Gerald. She wondered why there weren't more photos, or at least pictures of them with other foster children. Typically, a foster home showcased images of kids they'd helped. But here, there was just a single snapshot of a couple, with no real sign that children had ever set foot in the house. When she finished dusting, she moved to water the plants in the backyard. The day was overcast, the sky a dull gray that cast blurred shadows across the tall grass. As she maneuvered the watering can around the spiny rose bushes, she couldn't help but glance repeatedly at that shed in the corner. Though it was only mid-morning, the shed's dark, weathered boards made it appear draped in perpetual dusk. A heavy lock hung on the hasp, gleaming in the weak sunlight. She stepped closer, trying to see if there was a window or some other opening. She found none. Then, unexpectedly, Gerald's voice came from behind, so close that Mia jumped. "I said, stay away from that shed," he warned. Mia's heart hammered. She stammered, I was just watering the plants." "There aren't any plants near that shed," Gerald countered, his voice eerily calm. "Finish up over there." He pointed to the far side of the yard, away from the structure. She nodded, scurrying off. She had never intended to disobey, but she couldn't deny the fascination tugging at her mind. Why lock a shed so thoroughly if it only held tools? Why watch her so closely whenever she drifted near it? And why did Gerald's warning sound more fearful than angry? Over the next several days, Mia sank into a quiet rhythm. She attended the local school, an unremarkable building where she drifted through classes without drawing attention. She ate lunch alone or sometimes with a shy classmate, but she rarely formed friendships. At home, she followed the Owens rules. Meals at 6, quiet time by 8, lights out by 9. No locked doors. No unnecessary questions. She kept her notebook tucked beneath her pillow, writing whenever she sensed no one was around. She recorded details about the house, the yard, the tasks Nancy assigned her, and the tension she felt in Gerald's presence. It was on a chilly evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, that the predictable routine cracked. Gerald had been working in the backyard all afternoon, hacking away at overgrowth near the shed. Mia glimpsed him through the window, noticing he was moving items in and out. He had left the padlock hanging loose at one point to haul out a broken rake. That was the moment Mia's heart took a small leap. The lock wasn't secured. She could see the hasp dangling. A tiny wedge of vulnerability in the house's otherwise impenetrable rules. She bided her time, helping Nancy prepare supper. Nancy was unusually quiet, fiddling with a chipped teacup, eyes often flicking to the window as if she were keeping silent tabs on Gerald. The clock approached 4. Mia's stomach nodded with anticipation. She knew Nancy would put the kettle on soon, her daily ritual. She also knew that boiling water demanded the woman's full attention. Maybe it was the break Mia needed. Sure enough, Nancy excused herself for a few minutes to go sort laundry, then hustled back to the kitchen at the exact time the clock read 4 o'clock. The rattle of the kettle echoed through the house. Mia peeked out the window. Gerald wasn't in sight. In the far corner of the yard, the lock still dangled from the shed door. Mia made her move. She darted outside, crossing the grass quickly, heart pounding in her ears. She half expected Gerald to step out from behind the tree or call out to her, but the yard was empty. When she reached the shed, she hesitated. This was against the rules, and the Owens' warnings were never gentle. But curiosity overrode her caution. She gripped the padlock, lifted it, and found the door unfastened. The shed's interior smelled of mildew, oil, and something else, a metallic tang that made Mia's nose wrinkle. Dim light slipped through gaps in the wooden slats, casting diagonal shadows across a clutter of old tools. She saw broken rakes, battered gardening implements, and a lawnmower blanketed with dusty cobwebs. At first, it seemed as though the Owens had told the truth. It was merely a repository for junk. But she felt drawn to the far corner, where a tattered tarp lay piled beside a wooden crate labeled reunified in bold, black letters. Her heart thumped as she approached. The crate was nearly as tall as her waist, the letters faded but still legible. She lifted the tarp and saw a half-rotted cardboard box inside, only partially covered. It was shut tight, sealed with layers of packing tape. She tore at a loose corner. The tape peeled away with a slow, sticky sound. Inside were Ziploc bags, stacked with an unnerving precision. Each bag was labeled in neat handwriting, a name and a date. Mia's fingers trembled as she lifted one. It contained a child's ID card from some old school, a small drawing of a cat, and a hospital wristband. Another bag held a faded teddy bear, missing an ear, labeled with a different name. She gently sifted through these items, the full horror not yet sinking in until she noticed half the names had never appeared on any foster sibling lists she'd encountered. Where had these children gone? Her pulse grew louder, pounding against her eardrums. She carefully pulled out one bag that seemed more recent. The name was Marcus, and the date scrawled beneath it was from just last year. It contained a threadbare sneaker with untied laces and a battered notebook. She froze at the sight of the notebook. Her own notebook felt like her lifeline, so crucial, so personal. This was Marcus's lifeline, apparently left behind. She turned a few pages. The handwriting inside was that of a child, definitely younger than she was, maybe 9 or 10. The words scrawled across the pages told of confusion, fear, and repeated references to "Miss Nancy said I'll see my mother soon." The final entry read, "She said I'll be going back to my mom soon. But I never even met her. I don't think she's coming." The next page was blank. Mia's stomach lurched. Her grip tightened. A muffled sound outside the shed made her snap the notebook shut. She stood motionless, trying not to breathe too loudly. After a tense moment, she heard no more sounds. Carefully, she replaced the notebook in Marcus's bag, but she couldn't resist looking at one more. Another bag labeled Stacy held a stuffed rabbit and a library card. Another, labeled Tomas, contained a small t-shirt and a note scribbled in crayon. The name Owens appeared multiple times in these items, sometimes accompanied by the word scared. She realized this was no normal collection of junk. This was an archive, some bizarre stash of children's belongings. Foster children, presumably. Some might have been runaway kids, others might have been mislabeled as reunified with their birth families. Mia's heart rate tripled. Every story she had heard in the system about unscrupulous foster parents, about kids disappearing, about files being lost or manipulated, it was all swirling in her mind now. She realized she was standing in the center of something monstrous, something that had quietly grown out of sight. Suddenly, she remembered the time. Nancy would be done with her tea soon. Gerald might return at any moment. Mia shoved the box's flaps closed, replaced the tarp, and retreated from the shed. She made sure to tug the padlock back into place, hoping they wouldn't notice it had been disturbed. She dashed across the yard, heart in her throat, and slipped back into the house just as Nancy stepped out of the kitchen. "Did you finish watering?" Nancy asked, raising an eyebrow. Mia nodded, forcing a thin smile. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. We wouldn't want our garden dying, would we?" Nancy's words were innocuous, but her tone carried a hint of warning. Mia's skin prickled under that gaze. For the rest of the day, Mia felt as though she were on the edge of panic. She retreated to her room whenever possible, scribbling fragments of what she discovered into her notebook. The entire time, she questioned whether to report it. She was a foster child, new in this home, and for all she knew, people wouldn't believe her. Or worse, they might believe the Owens, who surely had some veneer of respectability that had let them foster kids for years. That night at dinner, the weight of the secret choked her appetite. Nancy hovered with an air of polite curiosity, noticing Mia's unease. Gerald barely ate, gnawing on his bread in silence. Mia managed a few spoonfuls of stew, occasionally glancing at the locked ring of keys by the back door. The memory of those labeled Ziplocs wouldn't leave her alone. She made it through the next few days without incident, but each hour felt like a balancing act. Nancy became more watchful, as though she sensed Mia's apprehension. Gerald lurked around corners, peering down corridors. Mia was almost certain she heard footsteps outside her bedroom late at night. She wrote everything down in her notebook in frantic scribbles, half terrified they'd discover her notes. School offered some reprieve, though even there, she felt too anxious to confide in anyone. She visited the library during lunch breaks, scrolling through public records on the old computers, trying to find mention of any child with the names she remembered from the shed. But the few times she located a matching name, the details ended abruptly with "placed in foster care" or "returned to family," with no further updates. She jotted down any reference she could find, cross-referencing them with the dates on the Ziploc bags. None of it formed a coherent explanation. One afternoon, she mustered the courage to ask the school librarian how to research public case files. The librarian gave her a hesitant look, as if suspecting something was amiss, but provided guidance anyway. Mia tried each name, each date, searching local news archives, but found next to nothing. It was almost as if these kids had been wiped from the system after leaving the Owens household. That was when she realized the scope of it all. If these children's records had been tampered with, the web of complicity must run deeper than just one family. A week later, her own name produced a jarring discovery. According to the official records, Mia was listed as the Owens' first placement. That was a blatant lie. Mia had been in multiple foster homes. Why would they list her as their first? The revelation sent a chill coursing through her. This was more than an isolated case of cruelty or negligence. This felt like a pipeline, a place where children vanished without a trace and official documents were doctored. Unsure who to trust, Mia considered telling her teacher, but fear held her back. The Owens might find out and punish her. She decided to bide her time, gather more evidence if possible. But each day in that house became more suffocating. Nancy's smile grew colder. Gerald's silence grew heavier. Mia clung to her notebook more tightly than ever, keeping it hidden under her mattress, in her backpack at school, or pressed to her chest when she slept. Then, everything escalated. It began on a Wednesday evening, just after Mia returned from school. She went to her room, but her backpack was missing. She tore the bed apart, rummaged through the closet, checked every corner. No sign of it. Her chest constricted in panic. That was where she kept the notes about the Ziploc bags. That was where she hid the partial names and dates she'd uncovered at the library. She charged down the stairs, brimming with alarm, but tried to compose herself when she spotted Nancy in the hallway. "My backpack's gone," Mia said, her voice quaking with forced steadiness. "Have you seen it?" Nancy's eyes flickered. "Maybe you left it at school." "No, Mia began, then paused. She knew for a fact she had brought it home. She remembered placing it in her bedroom. If she insisted, Nancy might confirm she took it, and that would be disastrous. She swallowed her frustration. "I guess I'll check tomorrow." Nancy's smile was pained, almost forced. "I'm sure it'll turn up. Don't worry." She walked away, leaving Mia alone in the hallway, heart pounding. She understood the meaning. They suspected she knew something and had likely found her notes. Even if they hadn't read them yet, they must have realized her backpack was suspiciously filled with documents and scribbled lists. From that moment on, the house's atmosphere sharpened into a state of quiet menace. Nancy's remarks were shorter, more clipped. Gerald's presence loomed, especially at night, when Mia felt him standing outside her door. She slept fitfully, half expecting him to barge in. With her evidence possibly compromised, Mia decided she had to act. She needed help from someone outside. The only person who came to mind was her assigned social worker, Ms. Rivera, who visited monthly to check on her progress. Mia decided to slip Ms. Rivera a note at the next meeting, discreetly outlining her suspicions and urging her to investigate the shed. But the day of the visit, Ms. Rivera was running late. Nancy and Gerald corralled Mia in the living room, speaking in hushed voices as they sipped coffee. Mia kept her face impassive, trying to appear as though she was just an uneasy child eager to be done with the check-in. Finally, Ms. Rivera arrived, wearing a polite smile. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a direct manner. Nancy stayed close, but Ms. Rivera insisted on a private chat in the kitchen, as protocol required. Mia settled at the table with Ms. Rivera, answering the routine questions about school, chores, and general well-being. All the while, Mia fidgeted with a small slip of paper she'd prepared the night before. Written on it were the words, "I found something in the shed. I don't feel safe. Please check it." She prayed Nancy wasn't standing too close. Ms. Rivera noticed Mia's trembling hand and frowned with concern. "Everything okay?" Ms. Rivera asked softly. "Yes," Mia lied, feeling the dryness in her throat. "I'm just tired." "You know you can tell me if something's wrong," Ms. Rivera pressed gently. Mia mustered courage, pretending to scratch her wrist while slipping the folded paper into Ms. Rivera's open briefcase on the floor. She watched it drop among the files. Ms. Rivera was called out to the living room a second later by Nancy, who had questions about scheduling and forms. Mia's heart thundered, hoping Ms. Rivera would eventually find that note. Before Ms. Rivera left, she gave Mia a knowing look, as if suspecting something was amiss but unsure how to address it under Nancy's watchful stare. Then she walked out the door, her car disappearing down the dusty road. Mia let out a shaky breath. She wondered how long it would take for Ms. Rivera to read that note. But if Nancy had rummaged through Ms. Rivera's briefcase afterward, was that even possible? Mia tried to quell the swirl of anxieties in her mind. That same afternoon, however, everything went wrong. Gerald picked Mia up from school unexpectedly, whisking her away before she could take the bus. She noticed the tension in his hands on the steering wheel, the deep lines etched across his face. He said nothing, but his jaw clenched every few moments, as if he were suppressing anger. When they reached the farmhouse, Nancy was waiting on the porch. She had the ring of keys in her hand. Mia saw the shed's door wide open from a distance. Her stomach flipped in dread. A shovel leaned against the shed's entrance, the handle muddy. Nancy's face was drawn and furious, yet her voice was eerily calm. "Come with us," Nancy instructed. "We need to show you something." Mia knew with absolute certainty that this was a trap. They had discovered her note. Maybe Ms. Rivera had confronted them in a phone call, or maybe they had found that slip of paper in her bag. It didn't matter. They were onto her. She turned and bolted, adrenaline surging through her limbs. She sprinted across the yard toward the fence. Nancy screamed for Gerald to grab her, but Mia was already halfway there. She scaled the rusted fence, tearing her palms in the process, ignoring the stab of pain. Gerald's heavy footsteps thundered behind her. She leapt down on the other side, stumbled, but kept running, legs pumping so hard that the orchard beyond the Owens property blurred in her peripheral vision. She dashed through the orchard, weaving around gnarled trees, scraping her arms on low branches. She heard Gerald cursing, footsteps rushing behind her. She refused to slow. Beyond the orchard lay a narrow gravel road. Mia followed it to a neighbor's gate, banging on it with all her might, shouting for help. Eventually, an older couple opened the door, startled and wide-eyed. Mia couldn't even catch her breath to explain. She just pleaded for them to call the police. The man ushered her inside, slamming the door behind them as the sound of Gerald's steps approached. Mia huddled in the foyer, trembling, while the neighbors frantically dialed 911. Police cars arrived within minutes, sirens cutting through the rural hush. By the time they reached the farmhouse, Nancy and Gerald were scrambling to concoct plausible explanations. Mia watched from the safety of the neighbor's porch as an officer stepped into the backyard and returned moments later looking pale and alarmed. Another officer guided Mia gently forward, asking her to show them exactly what she had found in the shed. Mia hesitated, but with the neighbors flanking her protectively, she led the way. Inside, the box labeled reunified was right where she'd left it, though it had been dragged to the center of the shed, as if Nancy or Gerald intended to move or destroy it. The officers removed the tarp, pried open the old cardboard container, and found the stacks of Ziploc bags. One officer cursed under his breath, removing a few and reading the names, examining the items within. Another officer discovered a loose panel in the floor. Beneath it lay more plastic tubs, similarly filled with labeled bags. The officers exchanged grim looks. Nancy screamed that they were being framed. Gerald shouted something about how none of it belonged to them. But the evidence was overwhelming. In a matter of hours, more law enforcement arrived, along with Child Protective Services and eventually Ms. Rivera. Word spread quickly through the county, drawing local news crews as the evening bled into night. Mia stayed with the neighbors while the investigation ramped up. She gave statement after statement, voice shaking but resolute. It came to light that Nancy and Gerald had been in league with a small ring of corrupt officials in the foster care system. Children deemed problem cases or simply inconvenient would be quietly rerouted to the Owens, who meticulously faked reunification documents or marked them as runaways. The real fate of many of these children remained uncertain. Some had been tracked to other states, handed off to unknown parties. Others vanished altogether, leaving behind only the personal artifacts that Nancy and Gerald had preserved for reasons no one fully understood, trophies, evidence, or some twisted sense of record-keeping. Nancy and Gerald were arrested that same night. Officers led them away in handcuffs, ignoring Nancy's tearful protests and Gerald's cold silence. Under intense questioning, Nancy broke first, implicating more than one caseworker, a couple of clerks in the foster licensing department, and even a local judge. She blamed Gerald, claimed he had forced her into it. Gerald, in turn, refused to speak, only glaring at the officers. The story exploded across local news channels. Reporters hounded the rural roads, setting up cameras outside the farmhouse. Interviews with former foster children began to surface, some of whom had only glimpsed the darkness before being shuffled along. A handful recognized items displayed on the news, sobbing as they saw reminders of siblings who had never re-emerged from the system. Meanwhile, Mia was placed in emergency foster care, briefly, with the same neighbors, who offered to let her stay until the authorities sorted out the next steps. She was given medical attention for her injured palms and offered therapy. She barely spoke during those first few days, too numb from the trauma. But she clutched her notebook like a life preserver, recording everything she felt: the guilt for the children who were still missing, relief that she had escaped, fear for what might happen next. As the investigation deepened, more arrests followed. Paper trails pointed to a tangle of corruption spanning nearly 2 decades. Files had been destroyed, falsified, or never recorded in the first place. Some children were eventually located, now teenagers or even adults, living with minimal documentation of their past. Others had simply vanished, with only the battered mementos in that shed to prove they once existed. It was a scandal that rocked the entire county, launching internal reviews of every aspect of foster care oversight. Mia's testimony became crucial. Although she was only 11, her account was the catalyst that brought the ring of abuse to light. The prosecutor handling the case recognized that her words, and her notebook, formed the backbone of the narrative. So did Ms. Rivera, who found Mia's note tucked into her papers weeks later, ironically long after the entire fiasco had erupted. Ms. Rivera apologized to Mia in person, tears in her eyes, for not being quicker to uncover the horror. But Mia only shook her head. There was no blame in her. She was simply grateful she had survived. Months crawled by. The date of Nancy and Gerald's trial approached. Mia spent that time in counseling, living with a new foster family who seemed genuinely caring. Every so often, she got nightmares of the Owens standing in her bedroom doorway, or the sense of caged dread inside that locked shed. But day by day, she grew stronger, forging careful friendships at her new school, learning that not every adult was an enemy. When the trial finally came, Mia was called to testify. She walked into the courthouse, shoulders stiff with anxiety, her new foster parents flanking her for support. Nancy and Gerald were there, seated with their defense attorneys. Nancy appeared more frightened than ever, her once-practiced smile nowhere in sight. Gerald looked almost gaunt, as though the months in custody had hollowed him out. Mia felt a surge of conflicting emotions, fear, anger, and a sorrow for all those children who had never escaped. The prosecution questioned her gently, guiding her through the events she had witnessed. She described finding the box in the shed, the labeled bags, the missing records. Each word came out calm and clear, despite the tremor in her voice. Nancy avoided eye contact. Gerald stared at the table. The courtroom was silent, except for the reporter's pens scratching at notepads and the clicking of someone's camera shutter. When cross-examined, the defense tried to sow doubt about Mia's reliability, insinuating that she was a frightened foster child misinterpreting harmless storage of old possessions. But the evidence was indisputable: dozens of children's items, official documents with falsified signatures, logs from Nancy's and Gerald's personal computers that matched missing children's case numbers. The defense quickly lost traction. Over the following days, more witnesses testified. Former caseworkers, terrified but compelled by subpoena, detailed how Nancy and Gerald had threatened them or bribed them. Investigators showed a paper trail proving large sums of money had exchanged hands under coded references. By the end of the proceedings, the jury seemed resolute. Nancy and Gerald Owens were convicted on multiple counts, including conspiracy, child endangerment, falsification of documents, and human trafficking. The judge sentenced them to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Their conviction, though hailed as a victory for justice, didn't end the heartbreak. Investigations continued into the whereabouts of children who had disappeared under the Owens' care. Some families were reunited with lost children who had been moved around the system. Others remained forever missing, with no leads. The entire scandal forced an overhaul of the county's foster care practices, prompting calls for deeper background checks, more thorough oversight, and accountability at every level. For Mia, testifying had been more than a moral duty. It was a way to confront her own nightmares. Standing in that courtroom, describing the events of that final chase through the backyard, she found a measure of closure. Though she would likely carry the scars of distrust and fear for years, she felt a spark of hope that things could change. Her new foster family, the Johnsons, seemed determined to give her the stability she had never truly known. They listened when she had panic attacks. They arranged extra therapy sessions. They encouraged her to keep writing in her journal, no longer a hidden secret but a recognized tool for self-expression. Mia spent hours pouring her thoughts onto paper, sometimes tears blotting the ink. Some nights, she curled up in bed remembering the faces of other foster kids she had once briefly met in her journey through the system, wondering if any of them had encountered the Owens. If they had, where were they now? She grew closer to the Johnsons' daughter, Allison, who was a year older. Allison had initially been shy around Mia, uncertain how to connect with someone who had been through such a harrowing ordeal. but shared jokes over TV shows and an accidental collision during a game of backyard soccer thawed the awkwardness. Soon, they were exchanging secrets about everything from favorite songs to their biggest fears. For Mia, it was the first time she had felt a genuine sibling-like bond. Even after the trial ended, reporters occasionally tried to interview Mia, but the Johnsons shielded her. They provided statements to the press, politely declining direct interviews with their foster daughter. Mia appreciated that they were giving her a sense of protection and choice she had rarely experienced. In her new school, she found herself singled out sometimes, especially by classmates who recognized her from news stories. But a few kind teachers helped deflect unwanted attention, treating her as just another student needing to catch up on missed lessons. In therapy, she confronted her lingering nightmares. She talked through the primal terror of that final chase, the suffocating sense of being monitored in the Owens house, and the knowledge that dozens of children had never found their way home. Her therapist guided her to find some semblance of control by focusing on the difference she had made. She had exposed the darkness that might have gone on forever if she hadn't taken that risk. That act of courage had saved future foster children from the Owens' grasp. Occasionally, Ms. Rivera checked in, guilt still evident in her eyes, though Mia never blamed her. Bureaucracies were labyrinths of paperwork and half-checked references, enabling those with cunning and malice to slip through. But Ms. Rivera's renewed determination to do better soothed Mia's cynicism toward the system. Slowly, Mia began to imagine a future that didn't revolve around fear. After many sessions with her therapist, Mia agreed to speak at a small local gathering about fostering changes. She stood in front of an audience of social workers, local officials, and concerned citizens. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on, describing how easy it was for kids like her to slip through the cracks, how powerless children felt, and how a single family could manipulate records when no one was truly watching. Her words sparked tears, applause, and a renewed sense of urgency among those in attendance. As part of the sweeping reforms, a new policy was introduced requiring multiple layers of verification for reunifications and frequent unannounced visits to foster homes. Furthermore, a specialized unit was formed to re-examine old case files that had suspicious endings. Many of the children whose belongings were found in the shed still had active missing person cases, and investigators continued to chase any thread of a lead. Mia's daily life improved steadily. She joined a creative writing club at school, channeling her experiences into short stories. Some were about magical worlds where lost children found safety in hidden forests. Others were more realistic, offering coded allegories of her journey. She found a measure of joy in weaving endings where the heroes triumphed and the villains were unmasked, giving her the sense of closure that reality sometimes failed to deliver. Every so often she thought about Nancy and Gerald, locked away in prison cells. She wondered if they ever felt remorse or if they even understood the magnitude of the cruelty they had inflicted. She told herself it didn't matter. They could never harm another child, and that was enough. A year passed. Mia entered middle school, forming cautious friendships and learning that she could trust people, albeit slowly. The nightmares receded into the corners of her mind. She found herself waking up to sunlight, not dread. She volunteered at a local shelter, helping sort clothes and gather supplies for children in need. She still carried the scars of betrayal, but she drew strength from the knowledge that she had helped dismantle a vicious conspiracy. On the day that marked exactly 1 year since she had fled the Owens property, she found herself standing outside the shed, though now it existed only in her memory. She closed her eyes, recalling every detail of that horrifying place, then opened them again to see a bright sky. She wasn't trapped there anymore. She was free. Some weeks later, her adoptive father, Mr. Johnson, who was working toward officially adopting her, asked if she wanted to revisit the old farmhouse. The authorities had closed the property, pending further investigations, and the house was eventually sold. Mia declined, feeling no need to see it again. She was forging new memories in a new home, a future unburdened by that dreadful past. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Mia joined the Johnsons for a small celebration. The adoption papers were finalized. A few of their friends gathered in the living room, offering hugs and laughter. Mia felt a swirl of emotions, gratitude, hope, and that fleeting sadness for all the kids who never got this second chance. She clung to the moment, letting it fill her with warmth. Of course, the broader system still needed fixing. The news continued covering developments in the Owens case and the larger corruption ring. More arrests were made, more caseworkers turned witness against higher-ups. It might take years to sift through the labyrinth of doctored files. But each arrest felt like a vindication for the children who had disappeared. Each new exposure was a victory for Mia, who had once thought no one would believe her. In the quiet aftermath, as the story's media frenzy settled into historical record, Mia found herself contemplating her purpose. She remembered how her mother, before losing custody, had always told her to speak up for what was right. The memory of that advice lingered, fueling her desire to keep writing, to keep telling stories. She considered eventually becoming an advocate for foster youth or perhaps an investigative journalist, shining light on wrongdoing. The possibilities stretched before her like an open road. Late one night, as she sat at her desk, she flipped through the pages of her battered notebook. Sections were dog-eared, margins filled with frantic scribbles from the time she was living with the Owens. Now, in calmer handwriting, she recorded her new reality, how her adoptive family called her "our Mia," how Allison teased her about crushes at school, how Mr. and Mrs. Johnson argued over who would cook Sunday brunch, but always ended up laughing. It was domestic normalcy, something she had yearned for all her life. Yet, one entry after another, Mia also wrote about the children whose belongings she had found in that shed. She listed their names, describing each object she could recall. She wrote small tributes, imagining their stories had happy endings somewhere out there. Even if some threads would never be tied up, she wanted to keep their memories alive. If she kept searching, maybe more truths would be uncovered. The sun eventually rose on a day that symbolized a final turning of the page in Mia's life. She was to stand before a community group, along with her therapist and a local journalist, to speak about foster care reforms. The last time she had stood in front of so many faces, it had been in the courtroom. This time, the setting was a modest town hall, the seats filled with families, social workers, and a few local politicians. She clutched the edges of the podium, nerves buzzing. Then she began to talk, voice trembling at first. She described how easy it was for a foster child to be silenced, how systems sometimes chose convenience over justice, how important it was to ask questions, even when the answers hurt. She spoke of the cruelty she encountered in Nancy's forced smiles, in Gerald's quiet menace. She recounted the mania in her heart when she fled over that fence, not knowing if she would make it. Tears glistened in some listeners' eyes. Many wore sober expressions, absorbing the gravity of her words. By the end, she received a standing ovation that felt more like a communal vow to do better. She stepped away from the podium and tried to contain the surge of emotion welling in her. For the first time in her life, she felt that her voice wasn't just her own. It carried the weight of countless unseen children who needed a champion. Outside the hall, she walked with her newly official parents. They embraced her, praising her courage. Allison squeezed her hand. Mia exhaled, letting the tension leak out of her. She still felt that deep-rooted ache for all the missing children, but for now, she would do her part to ensure no one else vanished like that. In the following months, more and more of the conspiracy's loose ends were tied. The now-retired caseworker who had coordinated with Nancy and Gerald was indicted. Several county officials resigned amid scandal. The farmland property itself was sold to a local nonprofit that intended to turn it into a safe haven for at-risk youth, a small gesture of reclamation. Mia never visited, but she read the news updates with an odd sense of relief. The place that had once been her prison might become a place of healing for others. Through therapy and the steadfast support of the Johnsons, Mia managed the trauma more constructively. She allowed herself to cry when memories hit too hard. She wrote in her notebook, not just about fear, but also about kindness and the slow triumph of building a real family. She felt a sense of pride whenever the Johnsons introduced her as their daughter. She even pinned a new photograph on her wall, an informal snapshot of her standing beside them, all laughing at some silly joke Allison had made. A family portrait at last, one not marred by staged smiles or hidden horrors. Time passed, and eventually, people stopped whispering about the Owens case, whenever they saw her. She was just Mia Johnson now, a middle school student, a budding writer, a thoughtful friend who occasionally wore a guarded expression but was learning to open up. The overshadowing fear receded. She still had to remind herself that not every locked door concealed a nightmare, and that the world was capable of warmth as much as cruelty. On a crisp winter evening, Mia's story reached something akin to closure. She sat with her adoptive parents in front of the television as a news special aired, an investigative piece covering the final verdicts in the Owens scandal. They watched archived footage of the farmhouse, the reporter's breath visible in the cold, flashing back to the day the evidence was first uncovered. They interviewed a detective who expressed hope that more missing children might be located. They included a snippet of Mia's courtroom testimony, her childlike voice echoing from months past. The broadcast ended with a reflection on the systematic failures that allowed Nancy and Gerald to operate as they had. Then the anchor spoke of small victories, reuniting a few siblings, the passing of new policies in the county, the wave of public outcry that demanded more accountability. Mia sat there in silence, her chest tight. When the screen faded to black, Mr. Johnson muted the TV. Mia turned to them, feeling an unfamiliar but welcome sense of relief. She leaned her head on Mrs. Johnson's shoulder, letting out a long breath. In that moment, it felt as if the last haunting whisper of the Owens farmhouse had loosened its grip on her. Of course, life continued, with all its small tragedies and joys. Mia had exams to study for, friends to hang out with, comedic family dinners to enjoy. But in the back of her mind, she always remembered how close she came to disappearing. She understood the responsibility of having seen the dark side of a system meant to protect children. She promised herself she would never stay silent if she suspected someone else was in danger. Years later, as Mia reflected on her time at the Owens farmhouse, she recognized it as the crucible that shaped her into someone who refused to accept surface-level answers. She had learned that sometimes, the innocuous calm on the outside hid monstrous intent within. She had learned that fear could be overcome by the imperative to protect others. She had learned that a single voice, a single girl, could topple a towering facade of corruption. And maybe that was enough to make her believe in hope again. Because for every Nancy and Gerald in the world, there were also the Johnsons and the neighbors who opened their door to a terrified girl. For every official who looked the other way, there were officers and social workers who wouldn't rest until justice was done. For every heartbreak, there was healing. She kept writing in her notebook, her words sharper, clearer, full of the certainty that truth was worth every risk. Those words became her legacy, a defiance against a system that had once tried to erase her. She was determined to ensure no one else would be lost in the shadows. And so, in the end, a lonely girl with a notebook and nothing to lose brought down decades of cruelty hidden behind a farmhouse's peeling paint. The Owens were jailed, the conspiracy exposed, and the battered boxes of children's memories were no longer stashed away in secret. Some might never see full resolution, but at least their stories had been dragged into the light, never again to be buried in silent oblivion. Thank you for sharing this journey. If you believe that these stories matter and that the truth should always come to light, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. And as always, thank you for watching.